Welcome to ILTV Security Brief. I'm Kalev Ben David. Each week, we focus on the latest developments relating to security and defense here in Israel and the Middle East, shaping this region and beyond. And we start with our roundup of the top stories over the past week. After Hamas rejects the latest U.S. hostage deal proposal, the IDF launches Operation Gideon's Chariot against the terror group. Prime Minister Netanyahu says it will continue until Gaza is under full Israeli control, Hamas is disarmed and expelled, all the hostages are returned, and the Trump plan for the Strip is carried out. Ahmed Sarhoud, a top member of the Popular Resistance Committee's terror group, is killed during an arrest operation. Staff Sergeant Danilo Malkeno is killed by an explosive device in southern Gaza, and Sergeant Yosef Yehuda Shirik dies as a result of a friendly fire incident during combat in northern Gaza. Israel resumes humanitarian aid shipments into Gaza despite opposition from some ministers. Prime Minister Netanyahu says the move was taken to avoid losing support from Israel's closest allies, and a new distribution system coordinated with the U.S. will prevent the aid from falling into Hamas's hands. Two staffers at Israel's embassy in Washington, D.C., Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram, were killed when a gunman opened fire outside the capital's Jewish Museum during an event for the American Jewish Committee. The shooter, Elias Rodriguez, was a far-left activist who screamed, "Free Palestine," when arrested at the scene. Yemen's Houthis continue to launch missiles against Israel, with air defense systems intercepting the multiple projectiles on Thursday as the Iran-backed Yemeni rebel groups unsuccessfully targets Ben Gurion Airport. Hamas resumed its rocket fire, with Iron Dome shooting down a projectile over Ashkelon on Wednesday night. Israel's defense ministry awards a $55 million contract to security company Elbit Systems to procure advanced protection systems for the Israel Air Force's Black Hawk and Apache combat helicopters. This includes innovative technologies to identify, disrupt, and neutralize threats and systems for deflecting guided missiles. And now to our big story. The IDF has begun Operation Gideon's Chariot, its new offensive against Hamas in Gaza, after the latest talks for a hostage deal reached a dead end. Prime Minister Netanyahu says it will continue until Hamas's military capacity is destroyed and its leaders killed or exiled from Gaza, and all the hostages are returned. But Israel is facing pushback, not just on the battlefield within Gaza, but in the international arena of international public opinion. Countries such as the UK, France, and Canada are threatening sanctions against Israel if it doesn't end its military action in Gaza, citing the worsening conditions there. And Prime Minister Netanyahu sparked strong opposition from some within his own government by approving the renewal of humanitarian aid that they say will end up in the hands of Hamas. Netanyahu said the decision was the result of pressure from some of Israel's strongest allies, even in the U.S.
עכשיו התעוררה בעיה, כי אנחנו מתקרבים במהירות לקו האדום, למצב שאנחנו יכולים לאבד שליטה, ואז הכל מתפורר. הידידים הכי טובים שלנו בעולם, סנטורים שאני מכיר כתומכי ישראל נלהבים, ללא סייג, שאני מכיר אותם עשרות שנים, באים אליי ואומרים לי כך: אנחנו נותנים לכם את כל הסיוע להשלמת הניצחון, נשק, תמיכה במהלכים שלכם לחסל את החמאס, הגנה במועצת הביטחון. דבר אחד אנחנו לא יכולים לעמוד בו, אנחנו לא יכולים לקבל תמונות של ערבה המונית, בזה אנחנו לא עומדים. לא נוכל לתמוך בכם. ולכן כדי להשיג את הניצחון, אנחנו חייבים איכשהו לפתור את הבעיה, עד שנקים את הנקודות הללו, ועד שנבנה את האזור הסטרילי, בשליטת צה"ל, לחלוקה של מזון ותרופות, אנחנו צריכים לתת איזה גישור מינימלי, בסיסי, כדי שלא יהיה רעב. זה המצב שבו אנחנו נמצאים.
And joining us in the studio now is Reserves IDF Lt Col Maurice Hirsch. He's director of the Initiative for PA Accountability and Reform at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs, and the former head of military prosecution for Judea and Samaria. Maurice, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Khalif.
Prime Minister Netanyahu laying out this new plan for distributing aid in Gaza that hopefully will be kept out of the hands of Hamas. How effective do you think this is going to be?
So I think what we have to stress, Khalif, is that from the start, Israel never intended to get to a situation where the population of Gaza was starving. Just from the start of the war, October 23 through February 25, Israel allowed the entrance of 1.4 million tons of food into the Gaza Strip, humanitarian aid. That was the goal. It stopped, if you remember, only when the talks, the discussions to free more of the hostages broke down at Hamas's initiative again. And since then, that's been the policy. Israel has kept a very, very clear hand on the pulse of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. And they've been watching it. If you remember, during the 6 weeks of the ceasefire, there were some 600 trucks going in every single day, 4,200 trucks going in every single week. We had a massive amount of aid that flooded the Gaza Strip, and that aid we've been watching and making sure where it is, where it's standing. And what we're seeing now is exactly what Prime Minister Netanyahu said. We've already developed this new idea of the humanitarian area that's being set up together with the US administration. And now, just until it's ready, we need to provide almost that bridge loan of the humanitarian aid, a minimal amount which will allow to feed the population until the humanitarian zones are fully set up and fully functional.
Right, but even with that, we see this increasing diplomatic pressure on Israel from some of the European nations, some voices in the U.S. as well, even in the Trump administration. President Netanyahu laying out his war aims the other night. Is Israel going to be able to withstand that diplomatic pressure?
So really what we're seeing, Kalev, unfortunately, very, very unfortunately, is the complete success of Hamas's propaganda functioning, going through the UN, being supported by all of the different UN functionaries, then spreading that mass propaganda around the world. We saw it with the UN saying, well, there's going to be the starvation of 14,000 children in Gaza within 48 hours. A complete lie. What the actual report said of the IPC was that in the next 6 months, there's a danger that possibly 14,000 children will suffer some type of food insecurity. But it doesn't matter to Hamas to tell the lie, and unfortunately also doesn't matter to the UN organizations to spread the same lies around the world, and that then influences the decision makers around the world. They haven't got their own individual and independent sources on the ground. They rely on the UN sources, and they unfortunately put their trust in them as well, for no good reason, I must say.
Right. Now, that's the external pressure from outside. What about internal pressure within Israel, where there is a growing debate here? Some of the criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu is that he hasn't really articulated the goals of the war clearly enough. Obviously, return of the hostages, elimination of Hamas. But what beyond that? He did speak to the nation the other night, trying to do that. How effective do you think he was in laying out the goals, especially of this Operation Gideon's Chariot?
I think what Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to do is, I think the goals have been very, very clear from the start, at least for myself, to destroy Hamas, free the hostages, and ensure that the Gaza Strip no longer poses any type of danger to Israel. The denazification of the population was really an integral part of that plan, and that's something which is now moving forward. What, on the other hand, we're seeing is growing frustration with the fact that we still have now 58 hostages still in the Gaza Strip, and the understanding from some parts of the population that as long as you keep on feeding the beast, as long as you keep on feeding Hamas and allowing Hamas to continue fighting via the distribution of the humanitarian aid, we are really abandoning our hostages. They are not the ones receiving the aid. They are not the ones receiving food. And when Macron and Lamy and the Canadians all stand up about the dire humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, they fail morally to say and to put the blame clearly on Hamas, because they are the ones who could surrender immediately, release the hostages, and bring this war to an end. But unfortunately, they don't care about the genocidal terrorists. They are willing to support them at the expense of democratic Israel.
Right, and clearly Hamas rejecting this latest, what they even called the Witkoff Plus proposal. There is the question, though, of what comes after Hamas. So Prime Minister Netanyahu went back to the Trump plan in the Gaza Strip, which involved relocating much of the population, and it seems like an American custodianship over it. We haven't even heard President Trump speak about the plan in recent weeks. How realistic do you think that is for the so-called day after in Gaza?
So the question, Kalev, really is, are the humanitarian organizations actually interested in humanitarian aid and support for the Gazans, or are they just weaponizing them and using them against Israel? The UN claims that 90% of the residential houses in Gaza have been destroyed, 66% of all buildings. They said that it would take 20 years just to clear the rubble, not even to rebuild, just to clear the rubble at an astronomical amount of money, $1.6 billion. In another report, they said it would take 13 years to clear out all of the fallen and unexploded ordinances. That would cost $1.7 billion. So they've got $3 billion that they've got to find from somewhere, and you're forcing Gazans to live in a situation in a demolition zone with ordinances that could explode at any stage. Or do you actually care about the Gazans and you allow them to go seek temporary refuge in another place? Eventually, those who would want to come back to a rebuilt and rehabilitated and reorganized Gaza Strip, I'm sure that neither President Trump nor Prime Minister Netanyahu would have any objection to that. But if you actually care about the Gazans, the only way to help them survive is to take them out of that environment temporarily and then to rebuild, not to force them to stay in that.
Right. Now, we mentioned the internal opposition in Israel, the debate here, some of the rhetoric seemingly getting out of hand. Yair Golan, who's a former deputy chief of staff of the Israeli army, saying it's becoming a hobby for killing babies by IDF soldiers. He later tried to sort of clarify or regretted the use of the word hobby. I mean, I want to get your response to that. And as I said before, this heightened rhetoric that inflammatory, some would say, here, even within Israel.
Unfortunately, Yair Golan yesterday joined the worst of the critics of the Jewish people, spreading the most really foul blood libel that's almost that has been so well entrenched, but has almost never been heard from actual Israelis against our own people, against our children, against our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, our cousins who are serving in the Gaza Strip, and to accuse them of killing babies for a hobby was, I think, a new low for any vile anti-Semite, and very definitely a new low for Yair Golan. And all he's trying to do, Kalev, is to grab a few votes in what will be the upcoming election, really to accuse Israel of such a libel simply for electoral purposes is pretty disgusting.
Well, I want to transition from that, because I do think it's related. The killings in Washington, D.C. yesterday, 2 employees of the Israeli embassy, an Israeli citizen, an American, a Jewish woman, Sarah Milgram, and Yaron Lashinsky, may their memory be a blessing, because that rhetoric, partially in Israel, but even more so elsewhere, even in the United States, it seems like is the charge of genocide. You mentioned the 14,000 babies, leads to incidents like we saw the other day in Washington.
Without question, all of this propaganda, all of these lies being spread about Israel, definitely when they're said by a senior Israeli IDF officer, even whether it be from the past or not, but at any stage, that fuels anti-Semitism. That is fueling it's not anti-Zionism, it's not anti-Israelism, it's anti-Semitism. They go and they murder people who they think are Jews simply for being Jews. I mean, the people killed were not Israelis and not even Jewish. Well, at least Yaron wasn't. So when you get into that situation where it's fueling simple Jew hatred, and then you get this terrorism which doesn't care who they kill. They don't care who they murder. They see a target, they identify it with Israel, and they go and slaughter in the hope that they are actually murdering Jews. And it doesn't matter whether they're Zionists, whether they're supporters of Israel, whether they're critics of Israel, whether they support Netanyahu. Yair Golan put targets on the head of every Jew in the diaspora for these crazy fanatics to come out and murder them. Unfortunately, that's what he did.
Right. Well, we should say, though, there's some of the rhetoric that we've heard in the U.S., as this gentleman was also a longtime anti-Israel agitator, this Rodriguez. All right, Maurice Hirsch, thank you for joining us on ILTV Security Brief.
Thanks for having me.
In the annals of Israeli espionage, no name stands higher than Eli Cohen, The Mossad agent working undercover in Syria succeeded in penetrating the highest circles of that nation's military before he was caught and hung in Damascus in 1965. For decades, Israel has unsuccessfully sought to return his body back home. But this week, the government did reveal it had recovered over 2,000 personal items belonging to Cohen, the entire Syrian archive on the legendary spy, including his letters, his final will, even the key to his Damascus apartment. The effects were presented to Cohen's widow, Nadia, by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who said they were recovered by a daring Mossad operation, although other reports suggest the new Syrian government approved the transfer as a goodwill gesture to President Trump. Well, joining us for more on this is Dan Raviv, a veteran journalist who has written extensively about the Mossad and now hosts the Mossad Files podcast. Dan, thanks for joining us. Dan, well, first of all, what is the significance, you think, of the return of these effects of Eli Cohen for his widow, for the Mossad, and for Israel?
Kalev, it's great to be with you. It's amazing that there's so much sentiment attached to this. Normally, when we think of the Mossad, both famous and infamous around the world as such a powerful and capable intelligence agency, you don't think much about them being sentimental, but they sure are when it comes to Eli Cohen. For 4 years, he was a secret agent in Syria. He managed to get himself into the most powerful places, the powerful circles, a friend of the Syrian president at the time. Again, that was 1961 to 65. And so the information that he was able to give to Israel absolutely helped Israel win the Six-Day War in 1967. So all of this is remembered fondly. The fact that he was hanged in a public square in May of 1965 has never been forgotten. And his widow, Nadia, around age 90, she is still a powerful spokeswoman, not only for Eli Cohen and his memory, but also for Israel's other secret warriors. She says that their sacrifices should never be forgotten. I'll bet there are others who did amazing things and penetrated Arab countries, but it's Eli Cohen's story, I guess because he was caught and hanged in public, that's become so famous, even legendary, Khaled.
Right. Now, let me ask you, there's been these reports, as I said, Prime Minister Netanyahu said it was a daring Mossad operation, covert operation. Other reports suggest the Syrian government, which is having these quiet contacts with Israel, that approved the transfer as a goodwill gesture to Israel and to President Trump after he met with Syria's leaders. Where do you think the truth lies, on which side, or maybe somewhere in between?
Yeah, I think it is actually somewhere in between. I mean, the official version from the Israeli Prime Minister's office is a daring mission with the cooperation of a strategic intelligence partner. So at first I was thinking, oh, well, a friendly country like Jordan, fairly friendly, and together the Israelis and Jordanians are known to have taken action in Syria over the years. I thought, oh, maybe Jordan helped them. And then I realized what I think is more obvious. As the regime of President Bashar Assad was collapsing late last year, there was a lot of chaos in the capital, Damascus. And as we do know, policemen and soldiers were taking off their uniforms and melting into the population. Well, what do you think people in Syrian intelligence did? They also melted away, but I think someone in Syrian intelligence at the headquarters would have known, wow, there must be a market. I bet the Israelis would pay for a suitcase full, maybe more than one suitcase, for 2,500 items having to do with their spy, Eli Cohen. I bet the Israelis would pay. So my strong bet is that we have a Syrian who took that stuff and through various intermediaries got in touch with Israel and sold it to the Israelis. One other thing, Kalev, we know that Israel still wants to find the remains of Eli Cohen. It's not known where the Syrians buried him.
Well, that was my next question. How much closer do you think, if at all, this brings us to the actual recovery of Eli Cohen's body, which Israel has been trying to retrieve since he was hung in Damascus?
Yeah, I mean, in writing my most recent book on Israeli intelligence, it was called Spies Against Armageddon, right? We spoke to the Israelis about that, again, the most sentimental part of Mossad history, and they revealed that there'd been contacts with Syria through European countries, a possible deal. The Israelis might have released some prisoners in exchange for that information and Eli Cohen's remains, and the word came back from Syria, he's under some building. One version was he's under a shopping center. We can't really dig it out. I will say this, that if the Mossad obtained the entire archive about Eli Cohen from the Syrians, and it does look that way, I have to believe that archive included where was his body buried. So I think the Israelis know now, and they might press the new regime in Damascus, perhaps as a goodwill gesture to President Trump, to make every effort to bring those remains back to Israel. And I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu said, after revealing this big story, that hopefully will bring Eli home. That's what he was referring to.
And then finally, you mentioned there have been books about Eli Cohen. There's been at least 2 movies, that Netflix series. But on the other hand, as you also said, there were Mossad agents whose legends and whose exploits we don't know because they were not caught. How much do you think the legend of Eli Cohen, the myth, lives up to the reality of what happened?
Oh, I think the reality is close. You may know that Netflix series also had car chases and a lot of shooting. That didn't happen in his work in Damascus. But the movies, the books, yeah, a lot of accuracy, but I can't underline it enough that people high up in Israeli intelligence over the years have told me that there are other Israeli spies who were long-time plants in hostile countries, in Iran and in Arab countries, but if they came home safely, we'll never know about it.
No, never. Maybe one day we will. Maybe one day you'll get to write about them or talk about them. Dan Raviv, in your podcast, host of the Mossad Files podcast, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
Thank you, Kalev.
And now a final word. Earlier this week, the Jerusalem Post declared that IDF spokesperson Brigadier General Effi Defrin is missing in action, at least on the media battlefield. Defrin was called out for keeping a much lower public profile than his predecessor, Admiral Daniel Hagari. So much so that a meme is now being circulated in Israel comparing him to the Where's Waldo character, asking, where's Effie? And also, the IDF's international spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Nadav Shoshani, is making much less of an impact abroad than such predecessors as Jonathan Conricus. Now, there's been speculation about why Defrin isn't speaking out more. Perhaps it's a response to those in the government who thought Hagari was too outspoken, or maybe to enable more of the spotlight to shine on Defense Minister Israel Katz. But whatever the reason, this is unacceptable. As the IDF intensifies its military operation against Hamas, while talks for a hostage deal have again reached a dead end, there is growing opposition within Israel against the war in Gaza and confusion over what the endgame there is. More than ever, Israelis need to have clear, timely information from the IDF on what is happening on the battlefield. And the public and press here must have more opportunities to hear from Defrin directly. Now, the situation is even more critical abroad, where the tide of international opinion, even among Israel's closest allies, is turning against the war in Gaza. The IDF must play a key role in presenting Israel's case abroad and be proactive in correcting the mistakes and slanders against its military operations that are often found in international media coverage. As a reporter here, I've worked with the IDF spokesperson's office for decades, and could say that in recent years, it has improved its effectiveness in getting out vital information to both press and public, especially via social media. But the spokesperson personally has a big role to play in that as well. And in that regard, there has been a backsliding in recent months at especially the wrong moment. It's time for Brigadier General Defrin and his colleagues to get back to the front lines of the media war, both here in Israel and internationally, before public opinion and diplomatic pressure undo all of the IDF's gains on the actual battlefield. Thank you for joining us here on ILTV's Security Brief.